The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission will be established under this piece of legislation. And the Commission will see, and the legislation will see the dissolving of the Irish Human Rights Commission and the Equality Authority. So the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Bill will merge the Equality Authority and the Irish Human Rights Commission together. And the bill will also seek to implement the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights by amending the European Convention on Human Rights Act 2003 to provide for an enforceable right to compensation for a person found to be unlawfully deprived of his or her liberty as a result of a judicial act. And I welcome that provision in relation to the bill, but unfortunately I can't welcome the amalgamation of the Irish Human Rights Commission and the Equality Authority, because I think it is a retrograde step. The Irish Human Rights Commission was established on foot of the Good Friday Agreement and required the government to ensure at least an equivalent level of protection of human rights as would pertain in Northern Ireland. And the primary duty of a human rights body is to hold the state to account in relation to the upholding of human rights. The Irish Human Rights Commission is currently accredited with the highest A status in the United Nations for the protection of human rights, which measures national human rights institutions against international benchmarks known as the Paris Principles. And it's quite likely that these will be reviewed. The standing of the Commission will be reviewed now on foot of the passing of this legislation, and we don't know whether it will retain the A status afterwards. The Equality Authority was established in 1999, replacing the Employment Equality Agency, and it works towards the elimination of discrimination and promotes equality in employment and the provision of goods and services across the 9 grounds that are well rehearsed in this House. And one of the things that the Equality Authority does is advise people on actions that they can take and advise them in taking those forward, those actions. And I wonder, will that provision still be available to citizens who have concerns under this new piece of legislation, where the investigation will be carried on by the new Human Rights Commission as well. And Minister, you have stated that the reason for the merger is to promote human rights and equality issues in a more efficient, effective and coherent way. And it has been previously stated, the impact assessment said that this bill would be expected to save €500,000 per year. And I note in your contribution, Minister, you said that you have increased the allocation towards the new Commission by, I think it was €1.9 million in last December. And that's welcome, but the important part to remember in that it still leaves this new Commission €1.5 million less and lower level of funding available to it than both authorities had in 2009. And I think that's a step that's going to seriously impact on its ability to carry out its work. There has been huge concern right across the through equality advocates and across the human rights NGOs in the state in relation to this merger, and I think unanimously everybody is opposed to the merger. I mean, the Equality Rights Alliance, a coalition of representing over 170 bodies and activists, are against the merger, and they have suggested that actually what is needed is 3 separate statutory organisations: a Human Rights Commission, a reconstituted Equality Authority, and the Equality Tribunal. I know the Tribunal is not affected by this piece of legislation, but it's interesting when you see across the board that people involved on the day-to-day basis in equality and in human rights are opposed to this amalgamation, but yet this government is continuing on with it. And there is a need in a new body as well for human rights and equality issues to be treated fairly. And it's interesting to note that in the UK, when they've amalgamated, actually equality issues took precedence over human rights, and the funding was allocated in a very uneven fashion in relation to the work that they could carry out and continue to do. And international research has shown that there's no evidence to show that integrated bodies function better than separate freestanding national equality bodies and national human rights institutions. And I think that's something that we need to look at, and we need to keep under review after the passing of this legislation as to whether it's actually the amalgamated body will actually be effective at all. In relation to the definition of human rights, there is 2 different definitions included in the legislation, and concern has been expressed in relation to the inconsistency of this. And Section 29 of the bill sets out a different definition of human rights to the definition contained in Section 2. And while the definition in Section 29 is meant to apply to the enforcement powers in relation to the new Human Rights Commission. I think that the difference and definition will have a very difficult problem for them in terms of their enforcement. The narrower definition proposed in Section 29 requires that the human rights in question would have force in the law of the state and the state. And this means that such rights would need to be enshrined in legislation or be at a constitutional level before they would be applicable to the functions and powers of the Human Rights Commission. And it is suggested that the IHREC would be limited in protecting human rights, as it could only directly encompass consideration of the Constitution, the European Convention on Human Rights, and even then at a sub-constitutional level where it has been placed into Irish law by the 2003 Act, and existing domestic equality legislation. And the Irish Human Rights Commission has stated that the fact that the state has a practice of not directly incorporating international treaties into national law, this would effectively exclude a number of significant treaties and conventions from consideration by the new Commission. According to the IHRC, the inability of the IHREC to respond to alleged breaches of fundamental rights protections contained in these treaties would significantly undermine the credibility of the new body. And if the government is serious about human rights, it would ensure that the new Commission would have the power to enforce all provisions in relation to treaties that this country has signed up to. And this could have potentially massive implications from a human rights perspective. For instance, the survivors of some physiotomy, they made a submission to the state claiming a violation of the UN Convention Against Torture and for a failure to implement an independent inquiry. And this new Commission would not be able to look into that. And in relation to direct provision, because would this new Commission be able to look into the operation of direct provision within the state as well? I think there's also a question of independence in relation to the new Commission. There is a consistent assertion that increased accountability of the IHREC to a government-sponsored department, namely the Department of Justice, isn't conducive to independence or high performance. And if we look at the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which was created in 2008, that it seems to have emerged as a best practice model, and it has no links to the executive, instead being accountable to the legislature only. The inquiry threshold outlined in the bill as well is also sets a higher threshold than what was contained in existing equality legislation in relation to the conducting of an inquiry by the Equality Authority. The idea of grave public concern versus currently for any purpose connected with the performance of its functions. And this actually in practice will probably limit the amount of work that the new Commission can actually inquire into and can look into. And much is made in the legislation about the imposition of a positive duty on public bodies to have regard for equality and human rights in their work. And that is to be welcomed. However, but the problem is that there's no provision for enforcement of that duty. And if we are to have really meaningful human rights and equality legislation in this state, every government department, every public agency should be required by law to take account of it, and it should be enforceable. Because if we look across the successive budgets under this government and the previous government, where there's been whole questions about the equality and the inequality of the actions taken, the Irish Human Rights Commission and Equality Authority should be able to look into that and should be able to make decisions in relation to it. And if we want to build a completely equal and fair society, we should be providing for that in our national legislation. In other jurisdictions, they have separate national equality bodies and national human rights institutions. Some countries have merged them, but a recent study has found that there is insufficient evidence to say whether the integrated bodies work better or worse than separate and freestanding equality and human rights organisations. And I think we should be maintaining the independence that we have of the Human Rights Commission and of the Equality Authority, and we should be strengthening them and providing them with the resources to ensure that they can act to ensure that all public bodies comply with human rights and have enforceable powers there as well to ensure that human rights and equality is applied with right across the state, because that is the only way that we can build a fair and equal society, because we need that oversight and that rule. And the other thing I would say, just finally, in relation to membership of the Commission, and I know that the members of the Commission have been appointed, I think that, last year, and they proposed to be the members of the new Commission. And while the legislation states that the Paris principles will be used in setting up the Commission, that I think actually the membership of the Commission should be specified within the legislation as well. The Paris principles state that non-governmental organisations, trade unions, and actually states as well that Parliament should be represented on the Commission. And I think that the legislation could be strengthened by actually including that in the legislation as well. Thank you, Chair.